Okay, hi everybody. Thanks so much for being here. So the title of the talk is Knowledge and Control. And what I want to do is kind of talk through some issues to do with relationships between knowledge and aspects of agency, really, but focusing on control. So you can find some discussion of relationships between knowledge and action in the literature. And at a very abstract level, you can think about this in the following kind of way. You might think, well, knowledge is about how the mind and the world are related in one kind of way. So when the mind latches onto the world in a good way, you get knowledge. And then something similar is true in the reverse direction for action. So when the mind produces behavior or moves the body in certain kinds of ways and it goes well, then we say, oh, that's action, or that's intentional action, as opposed to something else, random reflex or mistakes or something like that. And so one question some people have asked is, well, what are the relationships between knowledge and action? How might they be related? What can thinking about their relationships teach us about the structure of the mind? And some of this happens at a fairly abstract philosophical level. And that's mostly where the talk today will kind of be, is at a relatively abstract level. But you can also think about this in terms of some work in different research programs in cognitive science as well. Where does knowledge fit into our models of action control, for example? And how might action contribute to models of how we come to develop knowledge of the world and different aspects of ourselves? I won't be talking about that so much, but I'm happy to talk about that kind of thing in the Q&A time. So as I say, it's natural for some people to think that knowledge is very important for understanding action. So here are a few claims that you find in the literature. Not everyone endorses these, but this is just to give you some kind of flavor. So Pinheiros-Glasscock says, well, here's a principle we can consider. If an agent is effing, that is to say doing something intentionally, then she knows that she's effing intentionally and under that description. Really similar principle that Vicconi and colleagues call KT. An agent's doing something intentionally only if they know that they're doing it. And Bob Better and Carlotta Pavisa, who I'm going to focus on some of their work a little bit today, offer this condition that they argue for. Whenever an agent phies intentionally, they know that they're phying, and they have this knowledge in virtue of their knowledge of how to phy. Okay, so this is about how knowledge relates to intentional action. And the thought here is, well, it looks like, according to these claims, knowledge is in some sense essential to or necessary for intentional action. And these people will often go on to say, you can't really explain why an action's intentional or why behavior is intentional action unless knowledge is in the explanation in some way or other. So knowledge plays this crucial explanatory role. And J. Adam Carter and I have a paper, it's forthcoming. It's up on Phil Papers right now, the draft of it is, at the journal Ergo, where we kind of argue against especially this kind of thought. And we say knowledge isn't going to be essential to explaining intentional action. But what I want to do today is go a little bit further than that and think about a different kind of relationship that's really similar, and that's between knowledge and control. So the idea with invoking control here is something like this. You say, well, intentional action is behavior that's non-accidental in some really important sense, you know. So I might, you know, have a bet with Adam that I could take my cell phone and, you know, just for visibility, I kind of throw it and get it right behind that window, you know, like get it outside. It looks like it's pretty hard to do. I'm not going to do it. I probably wouldn't be able to do it. Now, you know, I could put a lot of money on it and I could try, and then, you know, if I did it one time, you might say, that was pretty impressive, but that seems like it was probably luck, you know, like you accidentally got it in there. And so then the question is, did you really do that intentionally? Well, could you do it again is one thing we might ask. You know, how many times could you do that out of 10 or something like that? And professional sports is often kind of predicated on these kinds of debates. How good are you really at something versus how often do you get lucky or something like that? Okay. So non-accidentality is thought to be really important. If something's too accidental, then you didn't do it intentionally. And this non-accidentality condition on intentional action is often understood in terms of control. So the idea here is if you have control, then you're able to reduce the luck that's involved in your action or something like that. You're more reliable in how you behave. And so Bob Better and Carlotta Pavisa have recently argued that we need to understand control, which is supposed to be this non-accidental thing that helps explain intentional action. We need to understand control in terms of knowledge. So it's a little bit different than understanding intentional action in terms of knowledge, because control is just one part of a kind of account of intentional action. More at the foundation of it. And so in a recent paper, they argue for these two claims. One they call the control constraint. So whenever an agent phies intentionally, they're in control of their phying. I'm not going to challenge that here, although I think it's a little bit unclear in an unhelpful way, but I'm not going to worry about that. Then they offer this epistemic theory of control. Someone's in control of their phying. So when I throw, let's say I'm really good at this kind of thing, and I take the phone and I throw it and it gets right through the window. So I'm in control of the action of throwing my phone through the window. They say you're only going to be in control of your phying when you do it, if and only if you know you're phying, so you have this kind of knowledge state, you know exactly what you're doing, and you know this in virtue of exercising your knowledge of how to do it. It's kind of two things going on here. One is you know what you're doing, or you know that you're doing something. And two is you have this knowledge in a special way in virtue of exercising your knowledge of how to do it. Okay, so people are going to have different views, I suppose, about that kind of epistemic theory of control, just looking at it from the outside looking in. There's a kind of tradition in the philosophy of mind and the philosophy of action that's associated with people like Elizabeth Anscombe. It goes back even farther to people like Thomas Aquinas that think that knowledge is really crucial for many aspects of action and agency, that might be kind of attracted to this sort of thing. And then other people, maybe more associated with Donald Davidson in the United States, but not just Donald Davidson, tend to write as if knowledge is not really that crucial for intentional action. And they might think, well, knowledge is not going to be crucial for control either. And so I just want to think about aspects of this proposal, and I'm going to offer three different kinds of worries about it, because I'm not a fan. But I'm going to try to explain why I'm not a fan and how I think knowledge and control might be related. So here's the first worry that I have about this proposal. And by the way, on the handout, I just have a few of the claims and a few cases I'll talk about, just so you can kind of check them and not just stare at the slides and that kind of thing. I'm worried that the epistemic theory of control, as it's specified, is potentially circular, has a kind of problematic circularity there. So this is the epistemic theory of control. And what I'm worried about here is, so you have to know that you're doing something in order to be in control of it, but you also have to know this in virtue of exercising your knowledge of how to do it. And so the question is, what is it to exercise knowledge how, right? It's natural to talk about know-how as something you possess. It's a condition of your mind. So there's some things I know how to do. I know how to get back to my hotel in Donostia, right? But I'm not exercising that knowledge right now. Right now, I'm just babbling to you about philosophy. Later, I'll exercise that knowledge. So what is it to exercise the knowledge? And here's a natural thought. The exercise of knowledge how is going to involve the exercise of an intention. And Carlotta Pavese, who's one of the proponents of this, in a different paper says something kind of like this. So I think it's natural for even people who think this theory is right to think of it in this way. She says that it seems that in order for agentive control to obtain, in addition to knowing what one's doing, one ought to know this in virtue of exercising their intention to perform the action and in virtue of being guided by one's knowledge how. So there's a bit of there in terms of guidance by knowledge how that I'm not going to worry about yet, but you're exercising an intention. And so here's the circularity worry. It seems like, to me, the most natural way to think about what it is to exercise an intention is in terms of control. And I say the non-deviant exercise of intention here because it's not just that an intention has to cause some kind of behavior, it's that the behavior should kind of go off in a non-accidental way. So there shouldn't be any kind of weird causal links or two weird causal links in between the intention and the behavior. And if you think about that just as control, then I'll say a little bit more in a second about this. But then you would, in effect, be saying someone's in control of their phying at a time, if and only if they know that they're phying, and they know this in virtue of exercising their control in how to phy. Right? So you can't really hope to explain control in terms of control. Now, why do I say that the most natural way to understand the exercise of intention, a non-deviant exercise of intention, is in terms of control? Well, because most people that have written about control have thought of it in this way. So here's John Bishop from the 80s. He says, well, look, you exercise control if and only if the causal link from basic intention to matching behavior is sensitive. And sensitivity specifies for him that over a sufficiently wide range of differences, had the agent's intention differed in content, the resulting behavior would have differed correspondingly. This is a kind of counterfactual sensitivity account of control. I'm not going to get too into the details. It's just one example. But for Bishop then, if you execute your intention when this counterfactual sensitivity relation is in place, then you exercise control. And there's no mention of knowledge or anything like that here, or knowledge how. Now, Shepard, that's me. I've got an account of control in a book that came out last year. He says exercise of control involves the production of behavior where the behavior kind of matches the plan state. So I have a plan. I don't know why I'm harping on throwing the phone through the window, but I started and it's too late. I've got a plan, throw the phone through the window. Does the behavior I produce actually look like my plan? Does the phone go in the right kind of way and land? If it does, in circumstances where the causal pathway I take is a kind of reliable, following a reliable route to success, then that's control. So control for me, at least when I was writing that book, is this non-deviant execution of a plan state where the right conditions are in place. Again, I don't mention knowledge or anything like that. So I'm understanding the exercise of an intention when it happens with the right conditions in place as control. And Marcos Villares, is just to give a third example, has offered a different account of control recently where he says if you're phying with control, then you're phying not just in the actual case, but also in all relevant counterfactual cases in which you attempt to phy. Okay. So he doesn't speak of intentions here. He's just thinking of phying as the process of acting that involves the exercise of the agent's relevant capacities. But it's natural, I think, to think that talk of the exercise of your relevant capacities is consistent with thinking that when those capacities are being exercised, you're exercising some relevant intention. I don't know if Marcos would really agree with that, but it seems pretty plausible to me. And so if that's right, then for Villares, controls the exercise of an intention when this right condition, that is to say, you've got a specification of success across relevant counterfactual circumstances, is in place. So that's three different accounts of control. None of them really talk about knowledge, and all of them talk about just the exercise of an intention when certain conditions are in place. That's why I say it's really natural to think of the exercise of intention as basically giving you an account of control. This is not a way open to the proponent of ETC, this epistemic theory of control. They have to have the execution of intention amount to something less than control. Otherwise, ETC is going to be circular. Okay, so what might they do? Well, there is one way, so it's not necessarily circular, this theory, because you might understand the exercise of knowledge how in a certain kind of way. So one option that's open, I guess, is you could say, the execution of an intention is to be understood in terms of the execution of a knowledge involving ability. So you posit a kind of esoteric ability. This is the ability to know. And that's what you're doing when you're acting. You're exercising an ability to know. Now, this is a bit unusual, and maybe people don't want to adopt this, but it's something you could think about. So Kim Frost has talked about this. He says practical knowledge is a capacity to do something rational and also an exercise of a capacity to know particular actions. And if that's how you want to think of the exercise of knowledge, how is the exercise of a knowledge involving ability, then it looks like you could have a kind of epistemic theory of control. But it would take extra work, I think, to say how the exercise of this capacity relates to an exercise of control. Frost is just talking about an ability to know. He's not saying anything about control, so you would have to do a little extra work to link those things together, and maybe you could. So all I'll say about that for now is this kind of account's going to run into some other kinds of problem cases I'll talk about in just a minute. So, okay, the account's potentially circular, and the best options available to make it non-circular, I think, run into trouble. Now I'll talk about a second worry, and I'm not really an epistemologist, so this part of the work has been done a lot by my colleague Adam Carter, but the argument here is environmental luck. There's a certain kind of luck that sometimes happens that seems to undermine knowledge, and this seems problematic for knowledge in a way that it's not problematic for control. So this is going to generate trouble perhaps for the epistemic theory of control. So let me give you an example of what I have in mind here. Now this is a case that Better and Pavis talk about as kind of supporting their view. So, and this is on the handout, I think. So they call it deer hunting. So Artemis, the goddess of the hunt, spies what appears to be a deer. She expertly notches her bow, aims, releases her arrow. It turns out that she was aiming at a life-sized papier-mâché statue of a deer. Not really a deer. And it had been one that had been constructed so artfully that it would fool even the most discerning eye. So not really shooting at a deer, shooting at a fake deer. But as luck would have it, a deer was standing directly behind the statue. Artemis' arrow passes directly through the papier-mâché sculpture and into the hapless deer. That's the case. That's a kind of environmental luck case. Luckily hit the deer. And what they say about this case is that shooting the deer is not under Artemis's control. So that's not an exercise of control because she was in fact not even shooting at a deer, she was shooting at a papier-mâché statue. And they want to say, well, here you can start to see how knowledge might help explain control. Because Artemis doesn't have knowledge that she's shooting the deer, and she doesn't have this knowledge because of the luck that's involved in the situation, that's why she doesn't have control. So they say, don't you see, environmental luck kind of undermines knowledge, and that undermines the explanation of control. But we think that there are other kinds of cases of environmental luck that don't work in this way, so that the explanation doesn't really generalize. So this is also on the handout. This is a twist on deer hunting. And this is the kind of thing that these cases and intuitions about cases, and I know that there's room to worry about their evidentiary value. But just read the case and see what you think. I'm actually curious to hear what you think. So imagine that Artemis sees 10 deer in the field. She chooses one of them. So she draws the bow back skillfully. She's really good at archery. So she aims, releases, and she hits like she almost always does. The twist in this tale is that every one of the other deer was surrounded by some kind of invisible force field that would have deflected her arrow had she happened to aim at any of those other deer. So again, in this kind of case, you might think Artemis doesn't have knowledge, and the reason you might think she doesn't have knowledge is because this is very similar to other kinds of cases in epistemology that demonstrate that luck seems to undermine knowledge. In particular, it seems to make the belief unsafe. So if you have a kind of safety view of knowledge, where a belief is safe in the sense that in most nearby possible worlds, where you form your belief in the same kind of way, the belief continues to be true. So if Artemis had picked any other deer, her belief would have been false. She wouldn't have been hitting a deer. So she lacks knowledge, but we want to say in this kind of case, shooting the deer is under her control. She sees a deer, she follows her normal route, she hits the deer. That's a shot that's under her control. So you've got an environmental luck case that pulls these two apart, we say. So you got a couple of options in response, I suppose. You might say, well, you can deny that the agent has control at all in these environmental luck cases. So you might give a very strong safety requirement on control, just as strong as the one on knowledge. Or you could deny that knowledge requires safety. That's an option that's open to you. Now I think option one, which is denying that control in environmental luck, control is always around in environmental luck cases, gets really hard to do when you start to think through the wide range of cases that involve a kind of environmental luck. So I'll just give you one more. This is a case that Kieran Setia has given a version of this. So in this case, a patient's hand has been paralyzed and deafferented. So they're not getting any feedback to the hand, and it's paralyzed. They can't move it. And I'll tell you, I wrote a couple papers 4 or 5 years ago, and I wasn't thinking about knowledge or anything like that, or control. I was thinking about conscious experience, the experience of trying in particular. And at this time, I went to the dentist, and I noticed that I was getting some procedure done. I noticed that half of my face was numb all of a sudden, like totally numb. I couldn't feel it at all. And I was like, oh, this is a great chance to run an experiment, you know? I can try really hard to move my nose or like move my eye and you know, see if I feel anything at all. So anyway, I'm sure the dentist thought I was a crazy person because that's what I was doing the whole time he was drilling in my teeth. I was trying to move my face. And it was a really interesting experience. But anyway, that was about a different paper. But there are these great experiments that go back to the late 70s, early 80s, where motor physiologists were really interested to understand whether the experience of doing something, this has nothing to do with this talk, but I'm going to tell you the story anyway, because this is like heroic science, where what they would do is they would paralyze themselves They would take a neuromuscular block so that they were fully paralyzed, and then they would try to do a bunch of things, and then they would come out of paralysis and they would record what had happened. And they did it on themselves because it's really hard to do this to other people. People don't want to have that done to them, you know. So anyway, Kieran Setia's case is about, we can imagine something a little bit like this, but put to a different purpose. So by noon, the paralytic's worn off. So the patient can actually clench their fist if they want. But they don't know this. Why don't they know this? Well, because the patient has these beliefs, unjustified but true beliefs, that the paralyzation is going to wear off at noon and they'll be able to clench their fist at noon. But the beliefs are unjustified because they got bad information. So someone told them the wrong story and said, by about noon you'll be able to clench your fist. That's bad information because normally it's going to take until whenever, 1 o'clock, something later. But at noon the patient has these beliefs that are true but unjustified, so they're not knowledge. They believe that they can clench their fist and they believe that they are clenching their fist. And so they clench their fist successfully. It looks to us like when you clench your fist, you're exercising control. That seems like a thing. If that's not, then the account of control starts to look really strange. But you don't have knowledge that you're doing it because of the weird story that is a part of the case. So that option 1, deny control in all environmental luck cases, doesn't look great. Could you deny that knowledge requires safety? Of course you could. Epistemologists have done this. But it seems kind of unpromising as a general strategy. I won't go into it. But many people think of safety as a kind of platitude requirement on knowledge, and Better and Pavisa seem happy to accept a safety requirement. So I'm just going to leave that there, but it's certainly an option to think harder about if you want to do the epistemology there. Okay, so that's the second worry. The third worry is about permissiveness towards risk. So there's a lot of different ways to think of this. I tend to talk about sports cases because I'm a fan of sports, and it's the playoffs right now, hockey and basketball. And Adam and I, we do a lot of worrying about whether you get the right bounces in the games that we care about, this kind of thing. I actually think these kinds of cases, you don't need to think about sports. Almost every action that we perform every day can be thought of in these terms, but I tend to think in terms of sports examples. So consider cases where you've got an elite performer, someone that's really good at something, but how often are they successful at what they try to do? Well, somewhere in the middle. So just to give you 2 examples, Megan Rapinoe is a soccer player for the US women's team. Her shot on target percentage, at least when we checked, this is excluding penalty kicks where her percentage is higher, but was at about 48%. That's much higher than most players. But how often does she actually get a shot on target when she takes a shot? Well, a little bit less than half the time. Similarly, Justin Rose, a golfer, he's the best, this was last year now, he was the best in the tour, the PGA Tour, at making putts from 10 to 15 feet away. Okay? That's something golfers do all the time, but not all the time. Not every time, I should say. So he's the best, and he was making about 43% of his attempts. So he's really good at it, but he succeeds less than half the time. Well, what are you supposed to say about what's going on with respect to control and knowledge in those kinds of cases? At least we want to suggest that performers like Rapinoe and Rose, given that they're really good, the best really in their sport at this kind of thing, when they engage in these relevant activities, it seems like they exercise control. At least they exercise some control. Okay. But do they know what they're doing? Do they have knowledge that they're, say, sinking a putt when they're making the putt? We want to say no. Why? Well, they miss more than they make. It seems like their kind of beliefs about whether they're succeeding or not are just not reliable enough, just not safe enough, whatever kind of condition you like. So the lesson from these kinds of cases is that exercising control and knowing that you're succeeding at what you're doing have different levels of permissiveness regarding failure in similar circumstances. We lean really hard on this principle in that ergo paper that I'm not really talking about today when we're talking about knowledge and intentional action. I actually think it exposes a pretty deep divide between philosophy of action and epistemology when thinking about these different things that has to do with the function of what these concepts do for us in assessing the nature and structure of the mind and agency that I won't really get into because it starts to sound like a sermon, I think. But I think it's an important kind of principle. So I think it's worth kind of emphasizing. I also think this kind of case, these cases about exercising control where your chances of succeeding are somewhere in the middle, makes problems for any kind of account of the relationship between knowledge and action that's kind of like Kim Frost's. So Frost said, you'll remember, that the execution of action is the exercise of a capacity to know particular actions. He wasn't talking about control. But I think it makes trouble not only for that particular view, but also for the control version of it. And the basic reason is, just think about Rapinoe or Rose, they often intentionally do these things. At least I want to say, they often, when he makes a putt, he intentionally made the putt. The success is just too risky to attribute knowledge to these actions, so you can't really think about their success as the exercise of a capacity to know if it doesn't involve knowledge. Okay, now you might try to weaken the principle. So this is on your handout too if you want to scrutinize it. Better and Pavisa consider a version of this principle, and then the paper that I'm kind of talking about now, it's got some referees that have been talking about the paper to us, and they suggested, well, you got to consider this version of the principle too. And it's an interesting suggestion. So here's a weakened version of the epistemic theory of control. If the agent's in control of their phi at t, then there's some action psi that they're performing at t in order to phi, such that they know they're psiing, so they don't need to know that they're phiing. They don't need to know the whole thing, that's maybe more difficult. But they do know this maybe smaller component action, and they know this in virtue of exercising their knowledge of how to phi. So, because they know, since they know how to phi, they know that phiing often requires some other subsidiary action psi, something like that. Okay. But a problem that I have with there's actually a number of problems I have with this, but I'll just mention one, is that it's possible to iterate the kind of cases that I've just been considering, such that the means that the agent takes, the subsidiary action, is also risky. So you might think that Rapinoe, just for example, she means to be making some kind of kick, free kick, say, instead of a penalty kick to make it harder, but something that involves, let's say, putting a certain spin on the ball. And it requires a certain kind of motion, of her foot and her hip, say. And she might only have, just to be arbitrary, it's something like a 65% chance of getting the spin right. So she often does it, but she often misses too. Everyone knows what that's like. You've got to try it 2 or 3 times and then you get the feel. So it looks like in that kind of case, again, even the subsidiary action, the psi that you're doing in order to phi, even that's too risky to say you know that you're psiing, okay? Now the proponent of this epistemic theory of control might say, well, surely there's some more basic thing that the agent's doing, and they've got to know that they're doing the more basic thing. There's some kind of really secure joint in the action structure. But it seems to me there's no reason to think, especially for human beings, that all cases of controlled behavior involve basic components that involve no risk at all. And it's possible that I'm a clumsy person, and so this point seems really intuitive to me. But all you need is one such case. So the clumsy person like me is kind of enough. So it seems to me that many of the means that we take to do something, including our basic actions, if you believe in basic actions, have middle grade chances of success. And if that's right, it seems plausible to think that we sometimes exercise control when we take these means, even though it's not as though there's no risk, no chance of failure in the things that we're trying to do. Okay, I won't read the rest of that slide. So I've presented 3 worries against this epistemic theory of control, and I've considered a weakened version of the epistemic theory of control and presented a kind of worry about that as well. But there's an interesting thing that comes up at this point, which is, well, perhaps the problem with this epistemic theory of control is that it has 2 requirements when it just needs 1. So it had 2. You have to know that you're doing something, and you have to know that in virtue of exercising your knowledge how to do it. What if we got rid of the knowing that you're doing it, and you just thought about exercising the knowledge how to do it? That's all you need. And this kind of thought might come up just from thinking in general about the relationship between control and know-how. So here are a couple of principles that you find in the literature. I've already talked about the control constraint. You also often find people endorsing IAK that's up there. Necessarily, if S phis intentionally, S knows how to phi. A lot of people find that really plausible. If you do anything intentionally, then we look at you and you say, well, you know how to do that. After all, you just did it intentionally. How could you not know how to do it? Now, we already talked about the control constraint. Whenever you phi intentionally, you're in control of it. And so you might think, well, those principles look kind of pretty similar. So control and know-how might be really closely related. How might control be related to knowledge-how? And it looks like if you want an epistemic theory of control spelled out in terms of knowledge, or knowledge-how, then the claim to make here is that control requires knowledge-how, presumably because knowledge-how is needed to explain control. There's another way to go here that I'll just mention, which is to say that control and knowledge-how are to be identified. They're just identical. So we have different ways of talking about the same phenomenon. Some people latch onto it with the term knowledge-how. Other people latch onto it with the term control, but they're just talking about the same thing. And that actually makes sense to me if what you're talking about is knowledge-how conceived of as a kind of ability. This view that's often attributed to Gilbert Ryle. Knowledge-how is not a unique kind of epistemic state. It's just a kind of ability that you exercise. But if you're what's called an intellectualist about knowledge-how, so you think that knowledge-how involves knowledge of propositional states about ways to do things, is one way to be an intellectualist, then you might not like this identification relationship. You might go instead for this epistemic version of control that we call ETC2. So you're in control of your phi at T if and only if at T you have knowledge of how to phi. Okay, so what is there to say about this different kind of epistemic theory of control? Well, I'll talk through a couple of cases that I think make trouble for it. Before I do, there's this distinction that we want to draw between general and specific know-how. It's similar to a distinction that some people like ILCLI make between general and specific ability. So, you know, the general and specific ability distinction, you can understand it like this. I have a general ability to hit a tennis ball with a racket. I'm not great at it, but I can do it. But I don't have the specific ability right now, because in these circumstances, for one thing, I don't have a racket. And for another, there's no ball. So I couldn't hit a ball with a racket in here. I would have to go find one. Have to put me in different circumstances. And so you might think, well, know-how, there can be general and specific know-how as well. And so there's a question about whether this ETC2 is talking about general know-how or specific know-how. So we'll consider both. So this is a case that's supposed to attack general know-how as the thing that's at issue in the view. It involves a guy named Ichiro. Let's say Ichiro bats .350. That means that 35% of the time when he's up to bat, he gets a base hit. One of the referees for not this paper, but the earlier paper, which also talked about baseball a lot, was like, I wish you Americans wouldn't talk about baseball so much. I don't know anything about baseball. And I was like, that's fair, but you know, I can't write 8 different sports examples just for, you know, it gets boring. But anyway, so sorry about this if you don't pay any attention to baseball. I don't really pay attention to baseball anymore either. I did when I was a little kid. Okay, so let's say he bats .350 when he's hitting against left-handed pitchers. Okay, so he's the best in the league when the person is throwing it left-handed. But he's terrible when he's facing right-handed pitchers, let's say. So he comes into the game, and this often happens actually. Guys will be really good against one-handed pitchers, and the other hand, they're much worse at. This is a dramatic version of the example. So tonight, he faces a lefty who throws a fastball, and he makes a hit. And what we want to say is, well, it looks like in that case, he has control. After all, he's the best in the league in those specific situations, but he doesn't have general know-how to hit fastballs. It has to be fastball from a left-handed pitcher. So he lacks general knowledge-how. So we have to think about a kind of circumstantially restricted know-how, specific know-how. Okay, so circumstantially restricted knowledge-how is a kind of interesting thing to consider. That just ignore what's most on that side. I already talked about the identity thing. So let's think about specific know-how, and this is, I'm sorry for the long case and all the words, but we call this old method, new circumstances. Okay, it's Ichiro again. So Ichiro's a skilled hitter, and he's playing recreational baseball with his friends, and a new pitcher shows up, right? So they're playing out in the yard. Somebody comes to pitch. He's never seen this person pitch before. And this pitcher delivers the ball in a way Ichiro's never seen before. It's an underhanded pitch. It's common to fast pitch softball. So if you don't know how this kind of works for baseball, I used to umpire baseball games when I was a kid. And you would umpire sometimes baseball and sometimes softball. And even for the umpire, it's really hard to see the ball if you switch really quick. It comes out up here, or it comes out down here, and it has a different trajectory. And it's really difficult. And there's actually a nice YouTube video of one of the best hitters in the world going against one of the best softball pitchers in the world. She was playing for the US team, I think, at the time. And she comes up and she's doing her softball pitch, and this guy just has no chance to hit it. It just goes right by him like every time. And it's kind of wild for them to kind of figure out that they can be so bad at something that's so close to what they normally are so good at. So, okay, in this case, Ichiro steps up to bat, and he's just really unsure that his normal way of batting, which is going to involve, synchronized patterns of attention, synchronized patterns of, the saccade of his eyes. This kind of stuff is studied in detail by sports psychologists. Looking at the flight of the ball, guessing where the ball is going to go, and you've got these rapid decisional processes about whether to make a swing and how to swing. He's really unsure that that's going to work. But he says, well, I just have to use my old method, okay, and see if it works. So it turns out, given his kind of natural talent, let's say, the old method works fairly well in these new circumstances. So he looks at the pitch, he sees where it's going, and he makes contact with it. So it looks like in those cases, he has kind of control, he exercises control, but he lacks kind of knowledge of how to use the right method. So we want to say he doesn't know that his old method, this way, is a way to make contact with the ball until he did it. So when he comes up and steps into the plate, he's going to hit. He lacks this kind of intellectualist knowledge of how to make contact, even though he retains significant control. So his control is going to come apart from his knowledge how in a way that's going to, I think, undermine this epistemic theory of control. Okay, so I'm almost done. So let me just suggest then a more kind of positive thing as a way to conclude, because I've been mostly negative. I've trying to think about this account that says that knowledge is really required to explain control. And it seems to me that what the truth actually is the reverse. So control is actually required to explain knowledge. So control is the more basic thing. So you need a kind of account of control, and that's something philosophers could argue about. But once you have an account of control, you can use it to do things like explain why knowledge is involved in action when it's involved. So just think about this kind of claim. It's put pretty generally. You could make it more precise, I guess. An agent doesn't know how to A unless they possess, they're disposed to exercise, sufficient control in Aing and doing that thing in relevantly circumscribed circumstances. And I'm far from the only person to kind of suggest this. Is actually in recent literature on this. You find something like this suggestion in 3 or 4 different people. So I'll just say one small thing in its favor. It's just this case that I call overconfidence. So Jim's been told there are 3 ways to do something, W, X, and Y. So there's 3 ways he kind of has beliefs about how am I going to do this thing. And he believes of all 3 that they're good ways for him to do it, okay? But in fact, only one is, because his abilities are going to be overly taxed by the other 2. So he's overconfident in at least 2 of these ways that he'll be able to succeed. Now, there's lots of ways to fill in these details. So you can imagine going to a climbing wall at a climbing gym. This is something I've been doing lately. I'm really bad at climbing, but one of my sons is really good. So I'll take him there, and he scrambles up, and I just sit there and get sore, because my abilities are really bad. So you can imagine this involves, different routes to get up from the bottom of the rock to the top, and one route doesn't require too much grip strength or difficult jumps or whatever. And the other 2 do, but Jim's overconfident, and he thinks that all 3 are good ways. So it looks like he has beliefs about 3 ways to get to the top, but he really only knows of one of those ways that it's a good way to get to the top. Why is it that he knows how to A, say, via way W, but not ways X and Y? Well, one candidate for explaining it is, well, Jim only possesses the right kind of control regarding the behaviors that are in this way. These other ways, he doesn't have control with those behaviors, and so he wouldn't make it to the top. So that's one little reason to think, or to at least get in the kind of headspace where you think, oh, okay, once you understand what control is, then you can see how control might help you understand why it is that you would have knowledge of how to do something or knowledge that you're doing it. And with that, I'll conclude. Thanks.
So, time for questions, comments, discussion. Thanks for the talk. So I'm not familiar at all with the topic, so I don't know the question makes a lot of sense. But it's about the third worry about the permissiveness toward risk. So, I mean, I guess I'm not that familiar with the notion of control, but I wonder why this low rate of success in the case of the performers you mentioned precludes knowledge, but why should we still say that they are in control? I'm not completely convinced that they may actually not be even in control.
Yeah.
So yeah, this is just to say a bit more on why should we consider that they are exercising control despite the low rate of success?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there's kind of two different things to say here. One is the way that we presented the case there, the cases, it was, I guess, meant to kind of jog intuitions about what it means to kind of have control. And so we were trying to jog those intuitions by talking about people who are the best in the world at doing what it is that they do. Well, they're the best in the world and they succeed an awful lot, so can we really say that they don't have control when they're doing that kind of thing? And one kind of way to respond to that is to say, well, yeah, of course we can say that. They're doing something that's incredibly difficult. Most people don't succeed very often at it, so maybe that's the kind of behavior that no one really has control, right? So in other words, the kind of cases that we're presenting don't really work. I think that's kind of like a fine way to go, and I'm a little bit sympathetic to that kind of pessimistic thought, which says that there are some things that people just don't have control over, you know. Trying to control a pandemic might have been one of them, you know. We just seemed to, you know, we all tried really hard and seemed to fail. So that's one thing to say, and if that's the way to go, then that part of our argument is kind of in trouble. A second thing to say is the way that this gets phrased, so in the epistemic theory of control, it's someone is in control of their phying at T if and only if. So you're talking about being in control is either you are or you're not, right? That's actually not how I think of control at all. So I've got, you know, a lot of stuff, a lot of words written about control at least. And I think of it always as coming in degrees. You either have more or less control. And you can talk about having control where it's a very low degree of control, you know, 0.1, 0.001. Levels are arbitrary, of course, but you know, you might think, I get this right 1 out of 100 times, but if I always get it right, every 100 times is at least 1, you might think, well, you're doing something that raises your chances above 0, but pretty low chances. That seems fine to me to say you have a really low degree of control in those kinds of cases. But if you think of control as like essentially something that comes in degrees, essentially something that's more or less, then this way of thinking is a little bit odd, and perhaps what's going on here is we're talking past each other a little bit. Because what I actually want to say in the kind of the Rapinoe kind of case is she has some degree of control. So we can attribute some control to her, but we can't attribute knowledge at all, I want to say. It's not like she has some degree of knowledge. She might have a kind of credence or something. Oh, I believe my chances are, but that's not the way that they're talking here. You have to know. So the same way that they think of, you know, you either have control or you don't. You either have knowledge or you don't. So I actually think that it's better to think just of control in terms of degrees and say you can have a significant degree of control while lacking knowledge. And so in a way that doesn't directly, this is part of why we were putting the cases the way that we were putting them. We want to kind of attack the way that they phrase it, so take on board the way that they phrase it, but I actually think that's not the best way to think of it. I would rather go for this degreed notion.
Well, you've been talking about knowing how, but at least intuitively it seems that to be in control has to do, at least in some degree, to know why. And I would like to know until what extent knowledge about how something works or why it doesn't work or why does it work would fit
Okay, so do you have a particular case in mind? So, where we're wondering whether you know how to do something, but then we're also asking, like, do you know why that the process works in this way or something like that?
I don't know nothing about the sports, but with cooking.
Yeah.
Some people, especially grandmas, know how to do things. Maybe they are not very good at explaining it.
Sure.
But it seems that in some cases, if you know why something is better than if you don't burn the food before doing something, or the other way around, it gives you control over the process. So
yeah.
I was just wondering how it would fit this scheme.
Good. So I actually think there's a whole kind of interesting series of questions you might ask about the relationship between kind of know-how and know-why, or know-how and understanding why, or something like that. I think it's something that's that kind of might push you over towards this kind of knowledge is important for explaining action kind of view, if you think, and I think it's plausible to think, as you just said, when you know why something works the way it does, that can give you an extra bit of control over how the process is supposed to go, right? You know exactly the right time to intervene, or you know how to fix something, say, if something goes wrong. And cooking is a nice example of that. And so in that kind of case, I think you have if you think about things in that way, you might have a nice example of how knowledge, even if not necessarily knowledge how, but let's say knowledge why, or understanding why, if you want to go that way, really helps explain some bit of behavior. So you were cooking, and then you tasted the soup or something, and it tasted a little bit off, and then you realized it was because you forgot the dill or whatever it is, and you go and you get the herb. And that actually seems true to me. And I guess what I want to say with respect to how these kind of knowledge-action relationships work is, what seems right to me is to say that in an awful lot of cases, knowledge is really important. Knowledge of a lot of different sorts is really important to explaining action and success and control and these kinds of things. So that knowledge can play a role in understanding why this person has more control than that person. Or knowledge can play a role in explaining why this person is more skillful than that person. I didn't talk about skill here, but you can think of skill as like a package of knowledge, how, and abilities and control to do a lot of different things, right? But at the most abstract level, since there are cases where you might not know how or why something works at all, you think about the artist before they're really well trained, they just kind of have this innate ability, maybe not fully innate, but this striking ability to do great things, with paint and a canvas. And they don't yet know exactly what they're doing, but you might say they have so much control over making a painting already. It seems to me that you have to theorize kind of control and intentional action a little bit independently of knowledge. So in other words, don't say that knowledge is necessary for intentional action or control. But then once you keep them separate, then you can start to ask questions about how they interact. And it turns out they interact in all sorts of really rich ways. And so that knowledge of why something works in the way it does might be a really important part of explanations, especially for some kinds of actions. I mean, especially you might think for actions that involve a lot of theoretical architecture, where you have to understand a little bit of the theory behind the thing it is that you're doing, and then that's going to help you actually manage the thing. So it's a question of like at what level are we kind of doing the theorizing? And so here I'm trying to tease these things apart and say there are some cases of this that aren't cases of that. But that doesn't mean that there's not a lot in the middle that's really important.
So I'm kind of curious about knowing what you're doing, because an action has potentially infinite descriptions, right? A lot of different descriptions, and presumably even ordinary actions will have a lot of different descriptions, right? So I'm kind of curious about this knowledge claim, because it seems, at least on one reading, right, it's super strong. And so presumably nobody would ever be acting on that account. What do those authors say about it? And what would you say about it?
Yeah, so you get different versions of a kind of knowledge claim in different people who write on this. Some people even say there's not any one particular description. That's the wrong way to think of it. Kim Frost says something like that. That's a little hard to understand what he means. But They want to say, no, like just think about at any level of description. So think about this practical knowledge principle. This is from a paper in Mind by Juan Peñaros-Glasscock. He's arguing against this principle, but Carlota Pavisa and Bob Better had argued for it in a previous paper. If an agent's effing intentionally and under that description, then she knows that she's effing. So you're right, unless you know that you're doing it under that very description, whatever it is, as precise as you like, I guess, you're not doing it.
Because I mean, I think, because it seems to me that you were talking about philosophy of action and epistemology connecting, but now you have philosophy of responsibility too, right?
Oh yeah.
And there it's going to be hugely important. And it seems like a lot of the time, what we hold people responsible for are not what they did under that description.
Yeah.
But we're saying this description fits, you should have known, and so therefore.
Yeah. Yeah, so this very specific way of thinking about what it means for you to act intentionally, you could go two ways with it, I guess. If you want to think about responsibility, you could say, oh, it turns out you're responsible for a whole lot less, and you could try to work moral judgment in that direction. But another thing, I guess you could say, and now I don't know that they've addressed this responsibility issue, is, oh, well, maybe intentional action is not the relevant category for, or intentional agency, since we blame people for intentional omissions, it seems. But maybe like intentionality is not the right category for kind of judging people. Intentionality is charting some different part of the terrain. But I tend to think that that's a little bit troubling. And I tend to think that a kind of strong knowledge requirement on intentional action can get you into trouble when you start to do moral philosophy about this kind of thing. This in a way goes back to that thing I said about the deep divide between epistemology and philosophy of action. I think they can clearly fruitfully interact, but then if you try to read one entirely in terms of the other, you can start to run into trouble. And that kind of thing, comes up too when people think about relationships between philosophy of action and ethics. I mean, philosophy of action used to be a kind of wing of ethics, really, and then there's I guess, some reasons why they started to move apart in some ways. But still, they really closely interact, and it seems like if you don't want to lose your grip on the thought that you're in control in some sense, or you're not going to blame you unless you had some level of control, maybe even some level of awareness, but that needn't maybe rise to the level of knowledge of what you were doing. So, yeah.
I mean, it goes the other way around too, right? So with the football players, it's like, well, we admire them because we think in a sense that she's responsible for hitting the goal, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so I generally think that, I mean, even not in sports, that a lot of the things that we do, because the world is not so friendly and so forgiving, a lot of the things that we do, there are parts of our success that you look at it and you say, that was a bit lucky, or that was a close call, or whatever. But since we still have to assess one another and we still have to understand how people are likely to behave, and that involves moral judgments and also practical judgments, I think in the case of action, this is what I meant when I said some of this has to do with the function of our concepts of intentional action and knowledge. It's really important for us to understand that we all are subject to a bit of luck and a bit of deviance in a lot of what we do. And that's fine. It doesn't mean we don't make achievements just because there's some luck. We still achieve things, we still do things, and we can still be praised and blamed for them. Whereas the function of a concept of knowledge is, I think, a little bit different, because there we really want to know, like, how reliable are you when you're telling me this? Or can I depend upon your knowledge as an expert? Or do I really have a good grip on this? So do I know it as opposed to something else? It's important for a different reason.
Kind of philosophy language question for you. About the gerund construction here, the effing.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, there's all these sort of old paradoxes associated with the imperfective, like, you're crossing the street even though you never make it to the other side of the street, you're giving a talk even if you don't get to finish it.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, for instance, you'd be running a marathon and know that you're running a marathon, even if you think the chance of finishing are pretty low, right? Mm-hmm. It doesn't block your knowing that you are running a marathon.
Right.
And so I was wondering if that offers any succor to the low achievement or chance of success cases that you're, because it's sort of like not clear, like,
Yeah.
In the case of hitting the ball, you might think, I know I'm hitting the ball, I just think I might miss it.
Yeah.
Just like I know I'm running a marathon, I know I probably won't finish it.
Yeah. So I think it's worth a try. This comes up in the philosophy of action as well, where some people want to restrict practical knowledge claims. You know that you're effing or fying or whatever. Only in cases where what you're doing is imperfective in this way. So you only know, your knowledge is in the midst of the action. It's not something that comes after once the thing's completed, is the way some people think of it. Michael Thompson makes some heavy weather of this, and other people. So you might think, okay, well, what does it mean to say that you know that you're doing something when you're in the middle of it, given that there's, chances that you might not do it? And there, I mean, this isn't just me. What some people have said is, well, there kind of needs to be some kind of relationship of non-accidentality between what you're doing and how you're doing it, and what would happen if things go well. So you have a sense with some of the things you're doing, you might not have time, or circumstances might be unfriendly. But are you in the middle of doing something that you're at least doing it in the right way, and then is it going to be accidental or not if you succeed, something like that, and how accidental is it going to be? And so there, I think what we want to say is, you still have to specify some kind of relationship between what you're in the midst of doing and how that thing is likely to turn out, if we want to say that even in the midst of doing that thing, you know that you're doing that thing. So if it's getting a base hit or hitting a home run or something, we still would want to say, make the knowledge present tense about an imperfected aspect of the process or something. It still seems wrong to say you know that you're getting a hit, given that the way you're proceeding is, in most nearby possible worlds, not going to lead to success.
But you also aren't getting a hit in those cases, right?
So,
like until you actually got the hit.
Say that
continuation rules aren't all ones.
Say that it's a case where you are getting a hit. Right, so you go on and you get the hit. Did you know in the middle of swinging the bat that you were getting a hit? We want to say no, because in extremely similar cases, in nearby possible worlds or whatever you like, you don't get the hit, even though you were performing in pretty much the same way. If you can, there's a move here where you could slice the possible world so fine that you say, no, like, when you're actually getting a hit, you actually do know, and but it starts to look like a pretty special, magical kind of knowledge, because most people don't seem to really be aware that they're in the good case when they're in the good case, We talk about this in that ergo paper, but we say a version of, I think, what I just said, so if that's unsatisfying now, then also in the paper.
Hi, thank you. This is really good. I don't know if I understand well what you just say now, that many people doesn't know if they are in the case where they are going to succeed or not. But it's kind of, I have the feeling that many people in the sports, in the case of, for example, football, I believe, or in the case of gymnastics, while they are performing, they know if, so they have control about the knowledge that they are going to fail. Maybe they don't know why, but they know that their action is not going to reach what they wanted.
Yeah.
Because they feel it. They have the feeling that I am going slower than I should. And in that moment, they know that they are going to fail.
Yeah.
So how can you say?
Yeah. So good. So here's where I think the structure of the dialectic is important to keep in mind, because I think you're right. So I think there are some cases where you might only succeed a part of the time, but it's because in some of the cases where you don't succeed, things are a bit off, and you even feel that they're off, and you kind of have a sense that you're making small mistakes or something like that. And in the cases where you succeed, things are a little bit different in an important way, so you have a sense, it feels like this motion's going just perfectly, and so this action's going to work out. And it seems plausible to me just to agree with you and say, in those kinds of cases, yes, you know what you're doing, and you have control of what you're doing, so they go hand in hand. But I'm not denying that there are lots of cases where you have control and you know what you're doing, and you could even say you know what you're doing in part because you're exercising knowledge how, if you want to understand that in some kind of way. there are some kinds of cases where that's true, but all you need to do are find some cases where that's not true. So some cases where you can't say, I felt it and I was in this special kind of relationship to the way I was moving in that moment, and so I kind of, you know, had this high level of confidence that was accurate, that things were going, you know, perfectly or close to perfectly. If there are cases like that, and it just seems to us that there are cases like that as well, then in some cases the knowledge and the control come apart in the way that those cases were supposed to illustrate. But I think it's right that, like, even in baseball cases, you know, you'll hear people say, it's not all the time, and, you know, I saw the pitch and, you know, I knew exactly what to do and I already, you know, it felt super clean, and you might say, oh, in those cases they really do know, even though in, you know, in other cases they might not.
So I wonder, just to return to this issue of knowledge and control. So for you, your intuition would be that in the case of responsibility, it would be control. That would be the important factor here and not knowledge, for instance?
Not just control. I think if you lack all control, so if the outcome was kind of entirely due to luck or factors outside of your control, then my judgment is that at the very least, our tendency to blame or the degree of blame or something is reduced. But I think things like the moral quality of your intentions or what you were trying to do can matter as well. So I wouldn't want to say it's just control, just because you can have a case where I try to do something really evil, but I really have no clue how to do it. But trying to do something really evil and believing that my method is going to be successful, I kick off a butterfly effect situation where very accidentally the evil thing comes about, you know, and I was at the beginning of the causal chain hoping that that was what was going to happen. And you might say, well, you know, your plan was absurd and you had no control over it, but there's something a bit weird. Even if we're just blaming you, even if we're not going to blame you for the outcome, now we could talk about whether, I don't know really what to think about whether we should blame you for the outcome, but we're definitely going to blame you for your intentions even though you had no control. And so in that kind of case, I think, well, this blame without any control at all, maybe. So I wouldn't want to make it just control. Similarly, it gets complicated because with knowledge, I don't know, you might think that you deserve more blame if you know that what you're doing is going to turn out in a certain kind of way. But actually, my sense is, as long as you have like true belief that it's going to turn out in that kind of way, I'm not sure that knowledge makes a difference.
Yeah, because I mean, I think that there's this sort of exaggerated idea, right? It's like, oh, well, evil is when people know that something is wrong and then they do it anyway. But it seems like a lot of people who do bad things, they just don't care. They don't even care to know, right? So they proceed without doing the kind of checking that you might think ought to be required.
Yeah.
Right? And then, sure, they're performing potential action, blah, 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 but the knowledge is not there, etc.
That's true. Yeah, these cases of kind of callous negligence are really, they can make you really mad for good reasons. Yeah, and they're right. It's not knowledge. I agree with that.
Any more questions, comments?
That's one more question.
Yeah, go on.
Curious about the Setia and the Artemis case. So this will feel kind of cheap, I think, when here's how cheap you think it is.
Yeah.
Well, in the Setia case in particular, so the guy has these unjustified beliefs that the paralytic has worn off, right? And then he goes to clench his hand. But when he starts to clench his hand, he gets evidence, like very quickly, that the paralytic has worn off, right?
So no, I should specify the case more cleanly. So the idea is that he's paralyzed and deafferented. That means he's not getting the feedback, no proprioceptive feedback. And let's say he's not looking at his hand. And the paralytic is worn off, but he's still deafferented. So he's not gonna feel anything about, all he's gonna feel maybe is that he's trying to clench his fist. But he could feel that when he was fully paralyzed. So the only thing that's different is now he's successfully clenching his fist. So he's not getting the feedback. But I think if the deafferentation bit doesn't work, then you could say, why can't you say as soon as he begins to clench, he's got the experience of doing it, it's vertical. How can he not know via that route? And I would say, yeah, that's right.
Yeah, so like with Artemis, like, it says that deer yelps.
Yeah.
That's evidence of like,
Yeah, sure.
protected by an invisible force field, which looks like it might
Yeah, I think that's right. So I think you just have to be more careful with kind of feedback loops in those cases.
Do any of these people talk about non-human animals? Because it strikes me that some of the problems, I mean, one could raise a lot of problems when it comes to non-human animals, right? Who surely do things, perform intentional action.
Yeah.
But the kind of knowledge that we have to ascribe to humans, we're often not happy to ascribe to non-human animals. And so it seems like there would be an obvious objection coming from that side too.
Yeah. So.
At least depends on what I mean, how thick the knowledge, the idea of knowledge
Sure.
is, right? Because it's kind of opaque, isn't it? Sometimes what exactly, like how substantial, like.
Right.
Is the idea.
So you would want to think about the theory of knowledge there, I guess, and how much you're comfortable attributing the same kinds of or similar enough kinds of mental states to animals, because I think it shouldn't be that controversial that animals do things intentionally and exercise a lot of control with certain kinds of behaviors. In that book of mine that I mentioned, I got a case against this kind of view a little bit, but it involves a kind of animal that's really good at defending their burrow. They have this technique for defending their burrow, but it's like innate, basically. But they've never had to do it before. And then they get the stimulus and they go into the routine and they kind of skillfully defend the burrow. And I want to say, well, they didn't know that they were defending their burrow in that case. Even if you say that in some cases they can know that they're doing things. People didn't seem to like that case that much. But there's not a lot of talk of this, I guess in part because a lot of the theorizing goes on in a certain kind of realm of philosophical space. You know, a lot of the people that are really into this knowledge thing, as I said, they kind of hail from Anscombe, who in a way kind of hails from Aquinas, and that was you know, not a group that was that prone to thinking about animal minds, you know. So I mean, maybe there's a bit of etiological explanation of that kind of thing, but I think it's definitely right that if you want to think about animal agency, you start to think of cases that look a lot like cases of control that are far short of kind of the attribution of knowledge, at least in traditional terms. And I think that some of the inclination with, I don't know exactly with some of the people I'm talking about today, some of the inclination there is going to be to just give a theory of knowledge that involves mental states with a certain kind of representational structure and say, well, animals can have those. So to have a less anthropocentric account of knowledge, maybe. But you would have to do the work, I guess, and show that it's good.
So, if you have any questions or comments, you can leave here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.